Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here and looking forward to getting to meet a lot of you for the first time and talk with you. I'll say a little bit about myself and then sort of what I'm hoping to do with the intro. Currently, I'm an assistant professor at the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. My background, though, is actually primarily as a historian and philosopher of science. And so I was at Chicago for a little bit and did a postdoc at the Field Museum. And then once I got to Arizona State, I really started to work with a group of systematists and evolutionary biologists here. And that sparked a number of collaborations around the Symbiota software platform and also thinking about biodiversity data integration more broadly. How do we make it fit for use and trustworthy? What are the social and technical systems that we need to enable that? So what I'm going to do today is kind of be a really big picture starting point, and hopefully that can kind of provide a scaffold or background for then thinking about what do you want to do? What are the sort of challenges of working together or making things happen that you've experienced, and how might TaxonWorks fit into that? So I'm going to put my philosopher hat on and talk about some big concepts to kind of frame things, and then we can zoom in and out as we need to. And I'm going to I have about 15 minutes to talk, but we can also jump in and open up at any point. So it doesn't just need to be me yammering for a while. Let me get my slides going. So just to touch base with the charge that Matt and Deb gave me. So here's sort of the text for the session this morning. So you need to do something. And in most cases with big data and data infrastructure, that means you need to do something together with someone else, because one person generally can't do it all. And so maybe you're a taxonomist, an ecologist, working on a collaboration around nomenclature, a curator, a collection manager, a developer. Hopefully part of what we can elicit today is what are the things that you're working on and thinking about or needing in your position in the broader system there, and how does that connect with TaxonWorks and other sort of software platforms or applications. So I want to just start with, here's where I'm going. And this isn't going to sort of make sense yet, but I kind of want to put it up front. Part of the idea is that we're pooling data to make it reusable with biodiversity information. So all of these observations of species, we don't just want them to sit in our hard drive or a filing cabinet. We want people to be able to use them. Well, how do we do that, right? Well, we have to put them together into packages somehow. And one way to approach that is to think about domains. These might be like groups in nature, like mammals, or insects or arthropods. Could also be geographic regions, or sort of groupings in our scientific theories. For example, our classificatory theories. And then within those domains, there might be different ways of connecting people and data together. And so maybe we try and put everything in one big pool that's centralized, that covers everything. Maybe we carve it up into different modular groups and then provide a point of access to get to each of, to stitch things together on demand. Maybe we have a bunch of smaller communities that sort of have a focus that motivates their individual work, and then they're coordinated in a sort of distributed or decentralized way. And then, oftentimes the default is we have a bunch of communities and they're not coordinated. And that could also be effective in some cases, but doesn't really speak strongly to the drive for reusable big data today. And so that's often not seen as satisfactory for our current situation. Okay, so if that's sort of where we're going, let me back up for a second and just start from ground zero. This will be tedious for some of you, but always good to make sure we're on the same page. So what is biodiversity data? What are we trying to put together into these repositories and make reusable, right? Well, we're sort of talking at the most basic level in terms of observations of where organisms in species are. So maybe there's someone out there in Central America that takes a photo of a javelina and wants to share that. And so might do that through this citizen science app called iNaturalist. And this is in fact Bernard Dupont's photo in 2008 that he took. And you can see that record here on iNaturalist's website. And it's not readable, but it's got a whole bunch of different fields associated with it. What is the species name? Where was it taken? What time was it? Anything else that was noted about the javelina? And then that information gets then distributed, published, and shared more widely, and it might end up in something like the global data portal called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. There are different versions of this, right? I've sort of given you a version that's based on taking a photograph, but I think a lot of you work with museum collection specimens, right, where there's a preserved physical voucher. And so there'd be a version of that where the voucher specimen gets digitized and then makes a similar record and then can go into different data portals. So that's what we're talking about in trying to make data about species reusable. But you can already see how there's more than one person involved in this, right? There's actually a lot of people that have to contribute to make this possible. And it also highlights the decentralized collection of the data in the first place, right? Bernard Dupont was doing whatever he was when he took that photo. And in fact, there are thousands and thousands of people that have collected data over centuries that we still want to have be accessible and usable today. And looking beyond sort of the basic scientific research problems of, what are the species, how do they evolve, how are they, what is their ecology, and so forth. I also want to highlight how biodiversity data is key to effective societal concerns around conservation, biodiversity loss, public health with COVID and zoonotic disease, and climate policy with the changing risks to ecosystems. And so one of the important concerns here is how do we make data reusable from all of these different people and times and places for situated decision-making, right? For conservation in a particular time and place, a particular state agency, for example, that has its restrictions on the taxonomies that it has to use, or the considerations of what kind of evidence it can consider, and so forth. And so thinking about not just how do we put data in one place from a lot of different sources, but how do we make it fit for use and trustworthy for applications like decision-making. And I want to introduce a concept here, which is maybe sort of familiar vaguely, but as philosophers, we pay attention to these concepts and exactly how they get defined. And so a lot of times I think we actually overlook the importance of data pooling, right? We'll talk about curation or aggregation or integration, but I really want to highlight how pooling is this making of a shared resource and not just putting data in one place, but harmonizing it into a coherent and fit for use body of information. And also in making it available, providing infrastructure, right, to manage and support access to that harmonized information. And then not just holding it in for ourselves or for a particular lab, but really governing that pooled data resource for the benefit of a broader community of users and stakeholders. So data pooling is all of these three things, right, as a process. And so, for example, a lot of the work that I think that you are up to in terms of digitizing specimen records and then pooling them into some kind of shared database that's accessible online and meant to be reusable by many different people in the public. So given that we want to make this data reusable and that we need to pool it from all of these different sources and times and places, one of the other things that's really important to consider is that if this data is supposed to be reusable for the long term, right, and that's really the motivation for a lot of specimen collections in particular, it also needs long-term care. And so if you think about, you have a data set, right, at a particular time, and let's say it's the best, most awesome and cleanest and most curated data set ever, if you then just leave it, right, as time progresses, it's going to decay sort of inevitably in terms of the precision of the labels for that data and how accurately the data are then labeled as the underlying categories change, right? The species are revised, people change their metadata categories and definitions and so forth. And so without long-term care, any data is going to increase in ambiguity and decrease in the percentage or proportion of records that are accurately identified according to the current reference standards for categories. So with that in mind, right, what are the arrangements of data pooling methods, technology, and people that would best suit biodiversity data? And to kind of give you a intuitive sense here, I've made an analogy between some of the things that biodiversity scientists have been doing and what you might be familiar with in trying to find dinner on a given day, right? So one mode is to make an off-the-shelf product, like a global aggregator where you go to the website, it's there, you find it, you download it, and you kind of eat it as is, right? Or maybe you want to have an assemble on demand process like Chipotle, right? You can think of this as like Meta 1 for ecological data. There's lots of different things that are fairly modular, but the one point of access that you can search and sort of stitch things together as you want to make a hopefully tasty meal. Or you might be more into having a personal chef, right? Maybe for an event or a particular group. And that's kind of like a conservation NGO. I'm thinking like NatureServe, for example, where they work with particular agencies or stakeholders to say, here's the decision you have to make. We've taken the data and prepared it for that decision and your specifications in particular. A lot of the data portals that are run through Symbiota are more like a themed potluck, right? Where someone says, I'm going to have a party, that's kind of like an NSF grant, and then you get a bunch of people to agree to contribute to the party under certain terms. In this case, it's a rainbow themed potluck, right? So some people are bringing the green food and the purple food, and then you're all contributing them for general access. And then you might just be doing it on your own, right? A DIY dinner party, and that's kind of like building your own database, right? Or your own data set. And you could put it on the internet, right? But it's sort of more of a one-off affair. And so just to highlight how, going to the left here, we're talking about increasing standardization and pre-processing of the data. And then going to the right, we're talking about increasing customization and effort for users. And so sort of right from the get-go, you can see how there's not just one necessarily right answer here, but important trade-offs and considerations in terms of what are the demands of the people that are hoping to get a tasty meal out of all of this. So let me pause here. I'd be interested to hear in the chat, what kinds of biodiversity data are you interested in working with or currently working with? And do you see that data being used in one of these scenarios in particular, where you're sort of imagining that it's going to go into a global aggregator, or you really have a conservation focus, for example, or a particular project that you're working on? Or is it more coming out of your individual project and you sort of hope for it to go somewhere and then be reused by someone else down the road? So yeah, take a sec. I'll pause. Tell me what kind of biodiversity data you're working with, and whether you see that data as fitting with one of these models in particular. Yeah, good. So we're getting a few coming in. Current and historic insect specimens, going to global aggregators and individual research projects, meta barcoding data. Yeah, so I didn't mention genetic data yet, but that's great to bring that in. Mostly a DIY, right? So we've got one for the aggregator, one for DIY, lots of custom databases, herbarium data for porting to public databases or supporting monographic research, curating data in Wikidata. Yeah, interesting question whether Wikidata is a global aggregator. I have to chew on that one. One of the distinctions between aggregators and sort of pure data commons is whether or not data curation happens in an aggregator. And so since Wikidata is editable, maybe it's just a giant data commons, but that'd be an interesting discussion. Basic species discovery, new and previously named species. Yeah, parasitoid database, cool. And needs to fit public decisions and research. Paleontological specimen data to global aggregators. Great, yeah, so a good mix here, right? And I think this is helpful to kind of orient toward the context in which each of us do our daily work, right? And sort of the bigger picture of how does it all add up to something that achieves these goals of trustworthy data that really impact things. All right, awesome. So in thinking about these sort of different models, right, these types of models for putting together data pooling, technology, and people, a couple of helpful concepts that I just want to highlight. One is a community of practice, and this often gets sort of used as a vague term, kind of like commons, but it actually comes from a specific scholarly source and has a kind of tighter definition behind it that I want to highlight. So it's a group of people, often from different organizations or backgrounds, right? Not just people working in the same job with the same specialization, but really people from a diversity of contexts who meet together to work and learn, sort of to advance a practice socially, right? To deal with problems, learn things, improve it overall, focused on some kind of topic of common concern. And so one good example here would be a multi-institutional data portal, where you've got different museum collections that are participating in a single digitization project, and they have regular meetings around the work of that digitization and getting it into the data portal, right? That would kind of give you a community of practice, where each of you have your different organizational contexts and possibly organismal groups, but you have the shared concern of the digitization project and the portal. And then the second concept is a boundary object. And so this is a really helpful idea because there are things out there, we often have this idea that if only we were totally precise and unambiguous, we would be able to get everything done together. Like then no one would misunderstand each other, and there would be no confusion and everything would be better. But that sort of presupposes that we're all on the same page about our background aims and values and beliefs and presuppositions. And so oftentimes it's harder to get things done if we have to agree on everything in advance, because we're not interested in the same things, right? Maybe I don't care about evolutionary biology. I just like taking photos of organisms and posting them on iNaturalist, right? I don't want to have to understand what species concepts are to do that. What I do want is the reward of participating in the iNaturalist community and taking those photographs. But the evolutionary biologist wants to be able to use that data and learn from it in a way that's actually meaningful scientifically, right? And so the photograph there is an interesting example of the boundary object, because it mediates between the interactions of people from different social contexts, the citizen scientist or the nature enthusiast, and then the evolutionary biology researcher, by allowing local differences in understanding. What are they up to? What are they valuing? What are they doing? But still having this stable object, the photograph and the record, that enables cooperation, right? Sharing of the information and the benefits between the two groups. And so boundary objects can also be things like southwestern insects, right? Or even a taxonomic group like mammals, or carnivores or rodents, for example. And the origin of the concept of boundary object itself came out of the study of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology and the original California Biogeographical Survey that was started in the early 1920s. And the specimen there was one boundary object. California was another one, because everyone cared about California in one sense, even if they didn't care about some of the ecological or taxonomic questions. Okay, so two helpful concepts there. Where does this take us? Well, there's different ways of trying to organize the communities and activities to have the data that people are sharing and reproducing add up to more than the sum of the parts. And so there's been a sort of ongoing dream here of having this all work hierarchically. This is a figure from Frank Bisbee's 2000 paper on the left, with this idea that we would have reference standards for taxonomy and then data sources that would have this kind of modular structure that you could then combine up into large units and then get a single global centralized data source like GBIF. And this kind of lives on in new forms, right? So here's a recent figure from a paper by Gallagher et al. On open traits, and a similar sort of dream of trait ontologies and organized in this modular taxonomic fashion, where you have lots of different data sources in the black dots, and then the green nodes are smaller and then global synthesis sites where you kind of put together all of these data sources under a single classification. So that's been one of sort of the regulative dreams or visions, right, for how biodiversity data should fit together. And what's then interesting is to sort of look at, well, what are the communities that have formed at the kind of lower to mid level? How are they organized? And maybe there's something else going on here that we should be paying attention to. And so this is a different figure, and this is kind of an ad hoc selection. But on the rows here, I have spatial scales. And then in the columns, I have different sort of thematic interests, right? So data aggregators like iDigBio or GBIF or GenBank, focus on ecological monitoring, interest in species interactions, which would include parasites, for example, or all ecological interactions more generally, focus on natural history and conservation. And so the arrows here sort of show the flow of data records. And I want to kind of highlight how it's not the communities that have actually formed don't necessarily do it in this nice tidy way around taxonomic groups, right? They might be interested in taxonomic groups intersected with geographies, or taxonomic groups intersected with ecological relationships, like with mammal parasites or arthropod parasites. Or they might be interested in particular jurisdictions or government concerns like monitoring mosquitoes or preserving natural heritage in North Carolina. And it's also not necessarily a simple vertical flow upward, right? And so NatureServe is a data aggregator for its different clients, including many state natural heritage programs. But it also gives data back to the state heritage programs, right? So it's not just a one-way flow. It's also a curation and sort of custom service like the personal chef, right? That gives each state program a context and also an integrated data set for its needs. Often includes particular taxonomies. And so the distinction between blue and red here concerns whether or not data curation is happening in that particular portal. And so you can see that there is sort of this upward flow, right? But a lot of the work, a lot of the communities are actually at the lower level working with the data. And so interesting to think about, what's sustaining these communities that are making the data, preserving it for the long term, in distinction to the aggregators that are receiving data but not curating them. Okay, so I want to come back to this, and then this is sort of where I'm going to wrap up. I've talked about these different models for data pooling and making it reusable. And this figure kind of helps orient us toward like, what are we thinking in the background about how this is supposed to add up, right? Maybe you were thinking, yeah, I just want one place that has all the data according to a single hierarchy of taxonomic domains. That's sort of been an assumption for your work. That has a certain kind of social organization, a community that goes along with it. What does that entail for the smaller communities here that have different themes as their interests, right? How do they fit into that kind of picture? Or maybe you had more of a modular repository picture. A lot of the work that I've been doing with folks at Symbiota at ASU has been oriented toward this coordinated repository picture, where you'll have groups that have a boundary object that kind of gives them the common concern. And there's some kind of professional society or organization that supports work in the long term around that, focused on specimens related to that boundary object, like Southwest Insects or California herbaria. And then we want them to be able to share data across each other, but it's really much more engaging and motivating, sustainable for them to have a focus that doesn't necessarily fit this clean and larger, but possibly hopeful, right, or wishful picture of the taxonomic domains, the natural domains as organizing everything. Okay, so there's some big picture, right? How do these things fit together? How are our data supposed to be organized? And what are the communities that go along with making those data work in the long term? I want to kind of bring this back down to thinking about TaxonWorks, right? And what are your projects How are you hoping that your day-to-day work is going to fit into this bigger picture? And so some general questions just to start with here. What types of data pooling infrastructure do you have or want? Are you already part of a data portal with a community, or do you feel like you need one, right? Are you looking for something to work for your collections organization, but you're not really worried about projects that span multiple collections? And what would you be hoping for TaxonWorks or other software package to help with there? Often software and people go together, right? So we need to think about the communities and the technical support and how they can augment each other. What are some of the boundary objects that capture how people share interest in your data, right? Are you thinking in terms of a state, a region, a decision, a taxonomic group? That would be really interesting to hear, whether you've got a focus and what it is, how to, or you're struggling to find that focus and sort of thinking about like, who is the community that I could be interacting with here? And then if you have, a boundary object in mind or a type of data infrastructure in mind, what are the organizations that exist or that need to be made that can really sustain that? Because, people leave, they get distracted by shiny objects, they get new jobs. There has to be something that really can take a data project forward beyond the 3 to 5 year timescale. And so thinking about professional organizations or government agencies or other sorts of groups, the species file group is potentially a cool example there, can be really valuable. All right, so I'm just going to say briefly that this work that I've been presenting is coming out of a larger interdisciplinary collaboration with some of my colleagues here at ASU, and has had some support from ASU's initiative, Strategic Initiative Fund, and these 2 NSF grants. But with that, I would be great to hear, I'll leave this up for a little bit, and it'd be great to hear questions, responses. I can go back and elaborate on things, or really take us in and take us to the concrete level now that I've given the big picture. Like, what are you thinking about? What were some of the challenges you were hoping to talk about and address today? And we can try and see how things fit together. Yeah, Chris, go for it.
Hi, very, very good talk, very interesting presentation. Thank you. I guess I like to think of myself as part of a global community, although I do have my own local community of people that work on the same group of insects that I do. But I think it's important for us as biodiversity scientists to think about ourselves as part of a global community. And the main reason for that is if we can get together as a community, we have more power, right? You think about the communities of other communities of scientists, like, particle physicists, for example, somehow they have been able to organize themselves into a very powerful interest group that has been able to get funding for these massive, massive projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, the Large Hadron Collider, for example. We need something like that for biodiversity. The problems that we're dealing with are just as complex, if not more so, as the ones they're dealing with. And the need for infrastructure to support that kind of effort on a global scale is really important for our community. We just don't have that yet. And part of it is because we're also focused on our little sort of parochial interests that we tend not to think of the broader picture and how we could get together and kind of try to coordinate efforts across, the entire community and agree on something that's big and massive and we could go for, huge amounts of funding for. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, good. And so
I don't want to be negative about this. My son works in the former particle physics, and man, there's just money flowing like crazy there. That money is not flowing in our direction.
Yeah, good. So then, what are the possible strategies there, right? So Chris was sort of saying, maybe the right strategy is to go big, right? And if we had a more unified or international community that could drive this, then that would really orient the support. I'm curious to hear, do folks think a different strategy is right? I mean, maybe there are local or regional approaches there that you would think might be more effective, for example. So just to get a sense of the range of views. Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, I wanted to say that a lot of the most important money, I think, that goes into at least diversity research is protection of the diversity, or protection from invasive species, for instance, which is arguably another diversity topic. I think that what we're missing there, that people like the Hadron Collider researchers have, is a very clear indication of how to make that important to big industry. I think that's not something that I don't believe we have the technology to argue that very clearly right now, but there is some research where, for instance, cures for specific diseases and things like that come from researching very obscure species, such as marine invertebrates.
Yeah, and so if one of the things about biodiversity, right, is that very little like effective policy action happens at the global level, right? There's the Convention on Biological Diversity and CITES and so forth, but even relative to the climate change in IPCC, these don't have the same sort of scale and sort of consensus around them for action. And so, right now it seems like a lot of the funding and activity is at the regional or local level. And so maybe an interesting, like, you could try and really dig into that, right? And say, how can we get more support from that scale? Or you can think about how do we unify these, right? Or how do we stitch them together? And so that's a great dimension to add there. And maybe there's, does it make sense to approach the connection to health through a kind of unified global approach, or by really digging deep into particular model systems, for example, or particular types of data? Host parasite data is increasingly recognized as important there.
Yeah, I think another thing another thing I thought about while you were elaborating there, it might be interesting, is also largely untapped, is the role of biodiversity in, it's going to sound potentially frivolous, but there's a lot of money in entertainment, in developing CGI, and a lot of those ideas are based on obscure diversity. Species forms that people have never seen before have gone into developing some big money CGI.
Yeah, I think that stuff is great, but I think we don't really give ourselves enough credit for the stuff that we're actually interested in as scientists. And for me, my main interest is documenting life on Earth. We still don't know how many species there are in Earth, not even to the nearest order of magnitude. Most of the species that are out there are still unnamed. That's a crucial scientific problem and a scientific need that's not being addressed. And part of it is because we don't have the expertise, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the funding to be able to get out and do that. And so I think we need to think about selling this. And that's why I'm talking about trying to get the community together and to get, our colleagues behind this kind of effort, a basic research effort of documenting life on Earth. That's an important problem. That's just as important, I would say, as finding the Higgs boson. I think that's probably something that more people can relate to, actually.
I agree with you completely. However, I do a lot of public speaking here in the Alamogordo area, and when I start to talk about that, my audiences, the eyes just glaze over. When I start to talk about how it impacts their management of the forest, and then they start to get interested. We just got to appeal to the folks we're talking to.
And I think it's worth sort of looping this back to, like, and what would be the software, right? Or what would be the, how do we design the infrastructure to make those pitches more effective, right? How can we, like, what do we need to put together to get the preliminary results to say, and now go big on this, world? Deb, I see you have a hand up, and I know there's a bunch of questions in the Google Doc too.
I just wanted to comment that what Chris is saying and what Roger said to me go together perfectly. So you can see an example, Randy Olson, who was a scientist turned filmmaker. He's in Hollywood. He has talked before, I think at Entomological Society of America meeting, I think is where I met Randy Olson. But certainly why science needs a story. So Chris, what you're talking about, and Eric, and what Roger was alluding to when he mentions things like Hollywood, et cetera, is this need for us to be able to convey the importance of what you just said, Chris, right? Why is that critical? How do we do that? And I think that, yes, exactly what Roger is putting in the chat. And we need to tackle it, I think, from multiple avenues. But I wanted to make another quick point too, for all of you who were intrigued by this notion of the sort of local to global picture that Beckett was envisioning. When you do your research, right, you have a specific goal in mind for your own needs, and that is going to encompass certain scope, might be regional, state, etc. So there's a paper, Kading and Kingston, that I put in the chat there that talks about the need to think about this very carefully. In a nutshell, the paper takes, you have these big questions about things like, if bat group A and bat group B hang out in a cave, right? And bat group A carries a particular virus, does it get into bat group B, right? And so the person who's interested in that sort of associations and transfer versus maybe somebody who's interested in general ecology of caves and who lives in those caves, there are certain questions that if the different groups don't work together, those questions are difficult to answer. And that paper, it does a really nice thing of building networks, people networks, a graph of publications showing sort of what questions can't be answered because those networks of researchers don't intersect. They don't overlap. And I think some of these bigger questions you're talking about trying to convey hint at the need for collaboration across discipline as well.
And so maybe we need data pooling and a portal focused on caves, right? And so like caves would be an example of a boundary object there that cavers are going to be really into, but also bat ecologists, right? And zoonotic disease researchers.
Yep.
And let's see, where was I? There was, right. And so one interesting distinction there is, sometimes what the public cares about, maybe like really cool, weird, funky organisms that you could make CGI versions of for your sci-fi movies are not driving the curation efforts. And so there might be a data portal that you would want that's basically a website that's pulling data from lots of different ongoing curation projects, but no one, no collections researcher is actually in there updating the records in that portal per se. But it really could highlight, package and highlight this specific interest, right? That's being supported by a much broader research agenda. So I think that's sort of trying to pull in, like, how does the work of data pooling, right, intersect with the things that people care about in a way that can align interests, right, and drive support for the research, but also really speak to the things that people who may not be into taxonomy or evolution at all per se still find really valuable. I want to give a moment here. Anyone who had put questions in the Google Doc, do you want to jump in and read them or say them? I can also start to go down the list too as well. And I've been trained to wait an awkwardly long time on Zoom.
Yes, right,
yes,
5 seconds.
Yes,
Beckett, I think that the questions at the bottom are all mine, except from the last one that gets at the intersection of TaxonWorks. I'm curious if I can ask you one that's sort of not on there about the physics gets money scenario. To me, I'm wondering if you have any experience in identifying what key figures, like what roles were there? Was it really a particle physicist who became a community, someone who could build the community, somebody who could lobby politicians, et cetera, or did new roles emerge in helping physics get big, right? I often am not, what I'm saying is, I'm often not convinced that taxonomists should be, for example, better speakers or better outreach people. I'm wondering if there's a need for they're not necessarily support, they're actually equally important, new roles in growing the sort of taxonomic endeavor, for example. Maybe you can reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the way science works, especially in the US and I think in Europe as well, is pretty recent historically. And so, before World War II, most research happened because you knew someone who was rich, right? And they would give you money, or you yourself were rich. And there wasn't the same professionalized sort of culture of grants and state involvement in supporting research. What really changed there was World War II and the importance of science, and in particular physics at the time, to the war effort. And so that was, Los Alamos and the atomic bomb, radar was also really crucial. And so literally most physicists got pulled into the war effort to work on applied physics and engineering problems. And that also catapulted them to, being major advisors for the national governments and military. It was after World War II that the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health got started, basically to sustain what from the US, for example, from its point of view was a matter of national security and sort of economic development, right? And so we have often this idea of like, well, if only the world cared more about science as this kind of pure intellectual enterprise of curiosity, the money that comes to science, since World War II is really being driven by concerns of national power and military and economic growth. And so physics was right there in that, crucible of World War II. And a lot of particle physics, I think, is not far from atomic bomb concerns, right? And so it's important to keep that context in mind. On the other hand, and a lot of recent biology, especially computational biology and interest in like radiation, came out of World War II and sort of the computational infrastructure that had been built there. So in that context, right, I think biology has ascended quite rapidly and now has similar stature in terms of overall funding and support to physics, but it may not get, it might not be hooked into the kind of large scale national infrastructure projects the way that big physics is. I think that's actually more and more debatable with like the National Ecological Observatory Network in the US and GBIF, for example. But the one way to look at that is, well, how do you position biology as central to the concerns of state or international governing bodies the way that physics was in World War II, right? Through public health, but which is kind of not the same as the military in terms of importance, but also national security risks through economic or ecosystem decline and climate change. So that may not be the route that you want to go, but I think in terms of understanding why physics had such a moment and sort of large scale funding, it's important to keep in mind, again, how the science is connected to these larger concerns that may not care about the research questions, right? The basic research per se at all. Sorry, hopefully that was an answer to what you had asked, Matt.
Can I expand on that just a bit? As the immediately after World War II, we had the Cold War, and a lot of money was poured into that, like the National Defense Education Act, which allowed me to get off the farm and into a college degree. And many of the entomologists who were my mentors came through that same system. Lots of money was being poured into that kind of science. That disappeared later. And right now, the only thing that we're dealing with is the military industrial complex, which managed to put a military construction plant in every congressional district. So in my congressional district, It's the military that's still driving all that. And there is, the only thing that's here that might help would be the biological weapons aspect of it, because here it's strictly military driven. Military industrial complex drives my congressional district 100%. And I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does where a lot of you guys live.
Yeah, I would just to say thanks. That historical context is so important, and that bigger picture of going back in time for things like TaxonWorks, et cetera. And what we're thinking of going forward and forward and forward. But it's really important to reflect on not just the longer term past, but the recent past. And maybe I can try to tie that in with some ideas about TaxonWorks, the species file group strategies for doing other things related to TaxonWorks in the second half. So I would just ask for logistics wise, Debbie, we're supposed to be done in 1 minute. Is that right? In the first session?
No. I thought it was in 15
15
minutes. 15 minutes.
We have 15 more minutes. I'm sorry.
We do.
Wonderful. Keep going. I would say let's look at the
With
chat.
that invitation to keep going, we all decry the loss of taxonomic expertise. And many of the taxonomists that were trained during that Cold War period are the ones that are missing now, that are dropping out of the system and not being replaced. I just wanted to add that to my little earlier diatribe.
So there's a point in the chat from John Harity that I'd like to sort of pull out, because it's a good connection back to TaxonWorks and sort of, what would we hope from the software and the communities to do for us here? So he's asking, are there ways to develop TaxonWorks outputs that would support grant proposals? How do we take the work of data pooling and its products and facilitate that pitch, right? Here is the thing that you care about, society. Let me show you how my work has been essential to that. So maybe that would be just good to dig into for a minute. What are the ways that you've seen that done well, right? Or the ways that you wish you could do that? I don't see if people have thoughts there, either in chat or discussion.
Well, all NSF proposals require a data management plan now. So the infrastructure is crucial. So if you have a really well-established infrastructure to support your project up front, put that in your data management plan, and that makes your proposal more likely to get funded. So I think it's crucial. And I think TaxonWorks has helped. And I've been using TaxonWorks and its predecessors to write NSF proposals since before they required data management plans. And I've had a good deal of success with that, just because of because these products, these infrastructures are really well thought out and really well developed, and that's a unique strength of using this kind of product to support something like a grant proposal.
And I'll just give another example of something that isn't quite doable yet, but that is a research project for the group that I'm in. I had that figure early on of like the increasing ambiguity and the decreasing accuracy of labels for a data set over time. It would be really interesting to actually make a real figure, right? Like with actual data for that. And so that's something that we're exploring using the Mammal Diversity database, where they're issuing sort of bi-monthly taxonomy updates. And you can think about, well, what if we had a data set that was indexed to a time, and then we look at the number of records in that data set that implicitly or tacitly become ambiguous when the taxonomy changes over time. Every time there's an MDD update, Mammal Diversity Database update. And so like if there are 250,000 records in GBIF for the mouse species Peromyscus funiculatus, it recently got split into 5 different species in 2019. So from the get-go, there's 250,000 records that are now ambiguous, right? Some of them are still accurately labeled, but because the species is split, we no longer know we're no longer sure what the correct label is, for the taxonomic name. And so like, are there examples of that where you could say like, hey, look, if we don't have MDD, right, or if we don't have a way to update our data records to handle taxonomic changes, here's how our data sets decline over time. I think that can have a real punch. It'd be interesting to hear examples there of what you wish you could do, or what you've been doing that's worked for you.
This is Deb. I would add, I'm looking at something that Nikki wrote in relation to what you just said, Beckett, that this notion that this local to global perspective comes to mind again. So when we're looking for what can TaxonWorks do, and for me as a researcher, for my group, but how does that relate to a particular region or an area? So this notion of impact worldwide, Alice Rueza from the World Wildlife Fund made the point at a recent conference, right, that the local stakeholder and their local needs, this is the kind of thing Eric was also alluding to, that's what you have to connect to as a boundary object, right? That who needs that information and how are they going to benefit from it? And I think that connects to that physics question that always keeps coming back up. How much of it is just the way in which they do their science? I mean, they can't all have their own telescope. The telescopes cost so much to build that they have a need for a shared infrastructure to do and answer the kind of questions they want to take on. They need those things. And so the very way in which they do their work and the tools they need to do their work influence what they're able to do. So is there a message there for us? In the way
I think
yeah.
I think I lost you there at the end, Deb. Can you say that again? What is the message?
I guess I'm saying, yeah, physics will keep getting money. Let's work in parallel. And that's your Matt's plus wanting what Nikki said. I think I'm trying to understand the physics question that always comes up. How much does the way in which they do their work drive the fact that they also got all this funding, right? You can't say, well, I need a $30 million telescope. Oh, I need a $30 million telescope. Oh, I need, and then they say, well, yeah. So is it because we have to connect the different silos? Do we need to think about how we do that so that it's not just thinking about our own individual world?
I mean, I think a real disanalogy there between physics and biodiversity is that those instruments that we're talking about have to be made because there's no other way to get the empirical access to the phenomenon, right? And so if you want to see deep into the galaxy, you need a really big, complicated telescope, and you can't just have 1,000 people do it individually. If you want to see subatomic particles, you need a really big collider, and there's no way for 1,000 people to do that individually. So it's not even about like we could build 1,000 particle accelerators. It's that it's a bottleneck for empirical point of access. And I don't think that's really the case for biodiversity data in the same way. I mean, I think the National Ecological Observatory Network is interesting here because standardization is important, right? Being able to compare data and remove overhead of making it useful is valuable, but not like having one monitoring station per se that's on the scale of an accelerator. So that also helpful to think like, how is biodiversity data different, right? Not just how could we be more like physics?
I mean, I think we can think of it in terms of efficiency of the effort, because yeah, we don't need a single massive instrument to do biodiversity discovery. But if we had a unified infrastructure, if we had a set of standards, and we do have that, we're working on that all the time. If we had more unified efforts, like people that go out to collect, if they don't just collect their one group of beetles that they're interested in, but collect everything that's there all at once in that particular mountaintop in New Guinea or wherever it is, and then we bring all that stuff back and we sort it out and we distribute it to the individual taxonomic experts. I think that's the kind of thing that we need to think about for biodiversity, just making our workflows more interconnected and more efficient, and using infrastructures like TaxonWorks to support that kind of effort.
Yeah, and ecological interactions might be an interesting pathway there, right? So a shift from the species themselves and where they are and what their boundaries are, to really think about like how are species together shifting in response to climate change, right? How are ecosystems going to sustain themselves in the context of increasing human land use? How are diseases being driven by ecological interactions and invasive species, for example? That puts real pressure on the software that we have for occurrence data. We need to think about interactions and their importance for society, and not just species in isolation that kind of get stitched together down the road. Just to throw that out there as a speculation.
Quickly, you reminded me, so just as a notion, what questions can we not answer the way we currently do what we do? So I think an example would be when you talked about aggregating at different levels, DIY to aggregator. The tritrophic TCN experienced that, right? They wrote a grant to get money to digitize the hemiptera and the host plants, right, for the hemiptera. And they put forth a series of questions that they said, once we get this data, we can answer this type of host species interaction. But at the end, indeed, there's data missing. They weren't able to answer the questions they thought they would be able to answer with the data aggregated for a variety of reasons. It's not present on the labels that they had, or not able to be digitized, or other reasons, or just missing, not collected. So there's another issue at that layer, right? Working together, as Chris just pointed out, where are the gaps, questions we can't answer with the current standard of practice.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Things that we haven't gotten to. It's a good moment to open things up again. If there is a question that you've been chewing on, but we haven't touched on, I'd love to hear it. From folks that have, especially from folks that haven't been chipping in so far, haven't been talking.
Maybe you raised some ideas that were a little unclear. It was sort of I think it came out in the fourth question. You said a little bit about data commons, aggregators, and data editing ideas. Can you reflect a little bit about, why aren't all scientists just capturing data on Wikidata? Maybe you could introduce Wikidata a little bit to those folks who aren't there, but why don't we just use Wikidata? What's going on? Like some of those concepts, it would be interesting to tease out a little bit more, because they reflect an end of the spectrum that's sort of different from what TaxonWorks does and sort of the same. And it'd be interesting to tease that out.
Yeah, well, let me say first, just what commons is also a word that gets thrown around a lot, and there's actually a very deep and worthwhile literature on commons coming out of the work of Eleanor Ostrom. And so let me just sort of frame that for a second. So it's the notion of a pooled resource, which could be like actual pooled water in a lake or a forest, or in this case, like a data set, right, that we've put together in one place. And then it's not just that you put it in one place and that it's available, it's just managed in a particular way for public access. So basically, so that people can use it without restrictions, and that it's managed in a way that ensures its sustainability. So being a commons is actually about how you manage it rather than the pooling of the resources. And I think that's helpful because it highlights how what commons live or die by is their governance, is the way that people work together to make sure that the data set doesn't just decay and get, fall off the internet, or the pool, the lake doesn't just dry up or get polluted. And part of it is that, going to the Wikidata question, on the one hand, some of us identify with the global scale, right? But many folks also don't identify with the global scale. Many people and that this is something that my colleague Nico Franz has sort of articulated before. When you think of your community, you might think of other entomologists, right? Before you think of GBIF, you might think of people that are concerned with conservation in the Southwest before you think of Wikidata. And oftentimes people want to work on things in communities of practice, interests, and environment. And so having to work in Wikidata is actually more like a special interest community, right? That's global and a certain kind of elite, but not representative or not comprehensive for all of the communities. And so some folks are like, yeah, I want to be at GBIF, I want to be contributing there, I want to be downloading and cleaning data there. Some folks with, I really want to be working on California, that's what I care about. And yes, I like that it goes to other places, but I don't want to have to deal with people who are working outside of California. I want to do my thing, right? And work with people that are also interested in California. And so that's part of why we see this, overlapping patchwork or quilt of communities and scopes and themes. It might be nice to imagine having one place that everyone aligns to, but if we sort of look historically, that's never really been quite the case. And so this is where the different ideals for where do you want this to go are really important. Should, to one extent, like Symbiota, for example, has more of an ideal of the coordinated smaller communities that share data but don't aim to have a unified structure, right? And does TaxonWorks have a view on that, right? Or is it trying to remain neutral? Is it trying to orient towards a sort of particular way of stitching things together down the long term? Is a really interesting question to discuss, right? All right, and now I think we're at time.
Yes, now we're at time with this lovely cliffhanger.
Come back for part 2.
Right, and so the idea here, everyone, your questions, your thoughts, your insights, and the fact that we are all supposed to get up after an hour, right? From sitting at our computers and look at something off in the distance and move around a little bit. So you have a half an hour now to go and collect your thoughts and ideas. And Beckett, hopefully you'll be able to join us for the second half. There's a pile of questions that some of us put in that Matt mentioned that are in the Google Doc. And then we can come back and we're going to work in the background during the break.
Beckett, if you wanted to look at some of those questions, we may circle around those. But while you're all taking a break, I have a 10-point list that tries to reflect on some of the ideas that Beckett raised and just tie them back to TaxonWorks. So we might start with some of those, and then if Beckett wants to, if you see something in the 8 questions that are listed in that Google Doc that really ties in, we can reflect back to those. And so, yeah, we've got lots of material to chew on. And there was some other questions in the chat that we'll try to tie in as well. So in half an hour, right?